I call Phil Twyford.
Mr. Speaker, there's a saying in the United States called selling the Brooklyn Bridge. And a person who could sell the Brooklyn Bridge was a con man, a fraud artist and a huckster. Selling the Brooklyn Bridge was the oldest scam. It was the oldest scam in the book, and these cons began after the bridge was built in 1883, went on for years. And the con man who was most famous for selling the Brooklyn Bridge was a guy called George Parker, who claimed to have successfully sold the bridge twice a week for several years. Some of his victims even put up traffic barriers to try and make a buck out of their new purchase. But what those poor suckers didn't realise was that they already owned the bridge. What is the difference, sir, between John Key and these scam artists who sold the Brooklyn Bridge? It's a rhetorical question, and I'm not expecting an answer from you, Mr. Speaker. The National Party's policy to sell off our most valuable, high-performing and profitable state-owned enterprises is a scam on the people of New Zealand. It's a fraud. We already own Meridian Energy, Solid Energy, Genesis and Mighty River. Let's look at what Mr. Key said in his Prime Minister's speech to this House. Mr. Key said he wants us to own our own future. And how's he going to help us to do that? He's going to sell off our assets. Now, I don't know who's writing Mr. Key's lines these days, but that's either so good it's bad or it's so bad it's good. All over New Zealand, mums and dads are watching TV and looking at each other in amazement, thinking, what is this guy on? He's supposed to be our Prime Minister. Does he think we're completely stupid? You see, either Mr. Key is out of touch or he's starting to believe his own spin, because the mums and dads that he's talking about all over New Zealand are struggling to make ends meet.
That's right.
Petrol's up, food prices are up, they've been whacked by this government's GST increase. The fees to send the kids to kindy or early childhood education are going up. They're not only struggling to save, Mr. Speaker, but they're struggling to get through to the end of the week. And Mr. Key thinks that they're suddenly going to pick up the phone and call their stockbroker and ask him to hold a few hundred shares in our country's energy companies. Well, even if ordinary Kiwis could afford to buy up these energy companies, how long do we think that those shares would remain in New Zealand hands? What do small investors do? They sell at a profit. Now, the share prices of these high-performing companies will inevitably increase. And what will those small investors inevitably do? They will sell. Who will they sell to? Almost certainly to foreign investors. And we can look to the experience of Contact Energy, privatised by the National Party in the 1990s. What happened? A controlling share ended up in the hands of Origin Energy, the Australian company. That, sir, is Mr. Key's idea of helping us to own our own future. The only real winners out of this policy will be foreign investors, not the mum and dad of Mr. Key's spin lines. Simon Power in Question Time today said that the government was going to make sure that Kiwi investors would be at the front of the queue.
That's right.
Well, I've heard some pretty unconvincing explanations for this policy over the last week, and that is one of the weakest. Sir, one of the main reason that the Prime Minister gave for putting forward this policy to New Zealand was that New Zealand has a debt problem. And as a response to this debt problem, he's going to sell off some of our most valuable companies. He said that we've got to borrow $300 a week, $300 million a week on average to pay the bills. And on a number of occasions, he disingenuously likened New Zealand's debt profile to that of Portugal, Ireland, Greece and Spain. Now, I think everybody knows now that actually the problem in New Zealand is private sector debt. It's not government debt. This policy of selling off our state-owned enterprises will do nothing to tackle the structural problem in our economy that we have with private sector debt. But in fact, it will weaken our government's balance sheet and weaken our ability to pay off our government debt. Bernard Hickey has usefully pointed out that the rate of return on these 4 state-owned enterprises is over 7%, and yet the government's currently paying more than 5%, just over 5%, on its current, recently purchased government debt. The government of New Zealand, the taxpayer, will be the net loser under this policy. Mr Key put forward the idea that by privatising these companies, that they'll be run more efficiently. And I would have thought, sir, that international events over the last couple of years with the global financial crisis and the behaviour of some of the biggest companies in the world would have finally put to rest this mythology that the private sector is always more efficient. Mr Key even mentioned the case of Air New Zealand and said that if Air New Zealand would be much more efficient and service-oriented if it was 100% owned. Well, what an extraordinary rewriting of our country's history. It was when Air New Zealand was 100% owned by the private sector that it made the phenomenally stupid decision to purchase Ansett. And we've seen, since the 5th Labour government bailed out Air New Zealand, we've seen the company return to profitability and to once more become an innovative company that we can be proud of for our national carrier.
8 years ago.
Sir, he also, the Prime Minister also claimed that asset sales would be good for New Zealand's capital markets. He ignores the advice of Treasury, which says that domestic saving and tax and regulation settings are much more important policy tools to increase the depth and breadth of our capital markets. Selling state-owned assets is the ultimate quick fix. It begs the question, sir, what will this government do when the cupboard is bare, when there are no more state-owned assets to flog off? It shows how absolutely bankrupt they are for ideas to grow the New Zealand economy and increase the wealth that's generated by New Zealand firms. They have nothing to say about savings, they have nothing to say about monetary policy, they have nothing to offer the country on innovation and research and development, or how investing in skills and training will give us the productivity increases that we need to grow more wealth in New Zealand. Their solution, sir, their idea of an economic plan is to sell off 4 of our energy companies, and that shows, sir, how utterly bankrupt this government is when it comes to policies that will grow the New Zealand economy and deliver the wealth and prosperity that we need. Sir, most New Zealanders today are worse off than they were 2 years ago. It's clear to everybody that this government doesn't have a plan. We've heard a lot of rhetoric about ambition. Katrina Shanks was just talking about how National wants most New Zealanders to be more than ordinary. We've seen cycleways, we've seen job summits, we've seen a woeful lack of serious strategic thinking about how to grow the economy. But what New Zealanders have seen, sir, is job losses, cuts to services and belt tightening and an increase in GST. All this government has to offer, sir, asset sales, cuts to public services and tax cuts heavily weighted to the top 10%. Sir, John Key's policy to sell state assets is a con. It's as simple as that. But New Zealanders are not stupid. They are not going to buy John Key's version of the Brooklyn Bridge. They didn't come down in the last shower, and they know when a con artist is trying to put one over them. Justice caught up with the con artist George Parker, who sold the Brooklyn Bridge, and the long arm of the New York Police Department caught up with him. They put him behind bars. And, sir, politically speaking, that's what I think is going to happen to John Key and this government. And we saw it last year in Auckland. Aucklanders didn't trust Rodney Hyde and his plans to hand over Auckland to his mates and their plans to privatise Auckland's assets. Aucklanders knew that Hyde was setting Auckland up to privatise their assets, and what did they do? They threw Rodney Hyde's candidate John Banks into the Waitemata Harbour. They elected a mayor who promised and who they trust to protect their assets, and they'll do it again in this year's general election.